All right, first we have a message from Cora.
I am a wonderful child of gracious God.
Very good, Cora. All right. And Bryn, you're going to read. You hold. Okay.
Genesis 2, 1 through 3. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on that day, he rested from all the work. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. He blessed it because on that day he rested from all the work he had done. Exodus 20, verse 8. Remember to keep the Sabbath day holy.
Mark 2, verse 21 through 22. No one sews a patch of new cloth on old clothes. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old. That will make the tear worse. No one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins. Then the wine and the wineskins will both be destroyed. No, people pour new wine into new wineskins.
This is the word of God for the people of God. Thank you. Awesome job. How many of you like to be counted? It's kind of a cool thing to be counted, right? I mean, to have a number, people recognize you. But sometimes you get tired of this world's counting. When I was a pastor in the Dakotas, it was a big health kick going on, and so we all got these step counters, right? I mean, some of them had them here, but we actually had them on our ankles. I felt like I was a prisoner every time I put one of those on. And so I remember, it was a big deal. I wanted to be healthy. I was walking. I enjoyed my walk so much, but I found myself, every time I had this counter on, more concerned about the steps I was taking than enjoying God's creation, and really having Sabbath time. And so one day I was walking on the bike path, and this thing dinged a couple times. I don't know if I had made an accomplishment or what, but I got so frustrated with that ankle counter, I took it off, and I was right by a river, and I just threw it in, and I gave it up. No, my conference was not very excited about me doing that, but really it was just tired of being counted, right? There are so many ways that people are keeping track of our lives. There ought to be a place where we can go where we're not counted all the time, but instead received and saw as great gifts, right? For just who we are. And I'm hoping that that's what our church is and can continue to be. And why did I throw that thing in the river? Was it that I hate systems? I was talking to Andrew Walsh the other day, and he said, I'm a contrarian. That's just who I am. You give me an idea, I'm going to go against it for a while. That's just who he is. Is that who I am? Maybe I'm just a contrarian. Was it that I didn't want to be healthy? No. It was, I think, because I need a time. I need a cathedral of time, a day, a walk, a float down the river where nothing about me is being watched, counted, or assessed. I need to be able to walk on just know that I can enjoy what I'm seeing without being counted. That, my friends, is what Sabbath, the idea of Sabbath, the idea of a day of rest, was always meant to be. It wasn't intended to be such a law, right? It was not intended to be another set of countings. The church turned it into that. Religion turned it into that. But it was meant to be a gift to every one of us, that we could practice together and rest. Rabbi Heschel, who has written an amazing book on the Sabbath, it's called Sabbath. Well, he was once asked by Walter Brueggemann, the great Old Testament scholar from our Protestant tradition, if he could sum up what Sabbath for him was. Give me one phrase, he said. And Rabbi Heschel said this: Sabbath is the one day I don't have to prove I'm a good rabbi. It's the one day I don't have to prove I'm a good rabbi. I just am. I'm just who I am. Today I want to talk about a revolutionary new concept brought about by our ancestors. The idea of all of us taking one day of rest to unplug and let ourselves be restored. But let me just say this, that here in the United States, we have a very complicated relationship with that word Sabbath. Especially if maybe you're a little older, when Sabbath was something very seriously observed. I think if you would look back in our history books, much of this confusion and anxiety comes from the Puritans. I know we like to celebrate those pilgrims, but their understanding of God drives me nuts. God was there ready to zap everybody if you did something wrong. That was their concept. And one of the reasons they came to the New World from England was because of their strong belief in Sabbath, and I think that was good. But there was an even stronger hatred for King of England at that time, who was trying to change Sabbath a little bit, loosen it up a little bit, and they wanted a strict observance of Sabbath. Let's take a listen for just a moment to how this is described in this new documentary I'm pushing called Sabbath. Let's hear about those pilgrims.
To look closely is to discover a Sabbath theme underlying so much of the American story, dating back to the beginnings.
One of the forces driving the Puritans from England to America was the opportunity to practice the Sabbath as strictly as they wanted. They felt that in England, it had become much too loose. There was drinking, there was dancing that was allowed on the Sabbath, and they didn't agree with that.
Most notoriously, King James I in the 16 teens had issued a book of sports where he permitted English people to, in free conscience, to engage in sporting activities on Sundays, which the Puritans didn't want to have happening at all. So they thought that not only is this just strictly unbiblical, but that it was, in effect, kind of inviting the judgment of God on England. And so the Puritans think we have a unique opportunity, almost unique in human history, to start over fresh and to see what it would be like to base a whole society on the moral law of God.
They were in church for 4 to 6 hours a day, even if it was really cold. They had laws on the books that said if you violate the Sabbath, you can be put in stocks, which usually didn't happen. Anybody engaging in commerce was violating the spirit, because if your competitor was selling on the Sabbath, then you would probably feel the need to sell on the Sabbath, and you would lose that opportunity to enter the different order of time.
You take care of the poor, you're responsible to your neighbor, and you don't provoke God by violating the Sabbath.
You hear that, right? Don't provoke God, because if you provoke God, what's God going to do? Zap you. God's going to get you, right? Anyway, I struggle with that. But that carried through. If you were maybe a little older like I am, Randy Roberts describes his understanding of Sabbath. When I was growing up, he says, some of the don'ts and do's really didn't make sense to me. For example, we could go hiking on the Sabbath, but we couldn't go swimming. We could wade into the water, but we couldn't get our head under the water on the Sabbath. We could climb trees, but we couldn't do too much running too fast, right? It was common, in fact, after Sunday dinner, we'd have people over, friends would come, kids our age, and when we were done eating, we were getting out of there quick because we wanted to go play. But right before we got out the door, Mom or Dad would stop. Wait a minute, kids, remember, it's the Sabbath. And we were like, what does that mean? We can run half as fast, we can swim, or we can swing half as high, we can laugh half as loud. It just was a confusing time for a lot of us. And I think because of that, and because of our strong belief in religious freedom, our society got rid of the idea of Sabbath as a whole society. We got rid of the Sunday blue laws, if you remember any of those ideas, and we just lost Sabbath completely. But what I'm wondering about is this: was that a good idea? Is Sabbath something we need to kind of relook at and see if it's something we need? In a world that goes on and on and on and counts and counts and counts and never stops counting, how do we find rest, right? And if we don't, is there a cost to that? Constantly going. A cost to our own lives and a cost to the world, to our environment. If we just keep going and we don't rest, what happens to our environment, right? So let's listen again now to what it might cost us.
They're not lost in the pursuit of this world.
It's a moment of just celebration and rest, but also it's a moment of clarity and reflection, because a lot of the times, especially like living here and in the city, it can get really overwhelming.
And when you don't sit down to rest, you don't have like a wellness strategy that tells you that it's okay to take a pause and to breathe, it's gonna start catching up to you. And you're going to now see the world and process reality through the prism of that exhaustion.
I think that's exactly what happens to us. We start seeing the whole world, not through the prism of grace and God's love and abundance, but instead through exhaustion. And when we look at the world through exhaustion, we just don't see much good out there, right? We only see through that prism. I hear that from a lot of you when I talk to you, how worn out you are, how tired of all the going and going and going. We're not healthy. Let's listen to one more little clip.
And in a global economy, the worries come at you from every place imaginable, right? People, even when they are not working, are thinking about their working. They're worried about what the competition is doing.
There's a lot of talk about unplugging, and there's an unplugging movement that we need to be able to not answer emails. We need to be able to turn off our computers and have time together, which I think is true. The thing that I think the unplugging movement misses is that we have to do this at the same time. Because if we don't, we're never really going to be able to relax. Because we don't trust that our coworker is unplugging too.
I'm a specialist in internal medicine, somatic diseases. And what do we have in somatic realities that seem to indicate stress? Well, one of the biggest expenditures in health plans are drugs for gastroesophageal reflux, that you have heartburn. It's a huge expenditure, and it is a symbol of stress.
I was thinking Cindy and I just bought a 4-pack of Pepto-Bismol. I mean, it's true. Stress brings out this stomach issues, right? So my task here today, what I'm trying to do is I want us to see if we can get an idea of taking the idea of Sabbath and putting it in new wineskins. Take about all the negative stuff we have about Sabbath, all that kind of stuff. Can we put it into something that's a gift for us, right? Something that we honestly can give ourselves. We read about in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, and Bryn did such a good job. God works and works and works, doing what God does on the creation story. For 6 days, God just puts in, creating. But on the seventh day, God gets up on a high mountain, lays down on the grass, listens to the birds, the wind, smells the pine trees, and rests, right? And simply enjoys where God is. Can we learn to do the same? My dad used to cook on Fridays. Now listen, he wasn't a great cook, but he got into this because Mom was a teacher, and she was always so tired when she came home on Fridays. So Dad decided, I'm going to cook. And so he always made like a roasted chicken with rice in it or something, right? And so, and it was enjoyable for Dad to do this. And so when we all gathered around the table, and there was a lot of us around the table, Dad would, kind of break the bread, almost like communion, right? We'd have our thing, and Dad would give us all some chicken and some rice. And then he wouldn't stop going on and on and on about how good it was. Wow, isn't this chicken good? Wow, so juicy, man, great flavoring. Boy, this rice is something else, He would go on and on about it. In a way, he was practicing Sabbath. He was being God. God created the world and said, wow, look at this stuff. It's great. I love it. My dad was doing that too. How often do we do that? Just, wow, look at what's out here. Look at what a gift we have today. Look at everybody. How beautiful it is today. I mean, this is the best day we've had in a long time. Time to Sabbath. Dylan Thomas, in one of his novels, tries to rethink Sabbath a little bit. And one of his characters in the novel that he writes says this: even at its stormiest, Sabbath was a blessed day. Ursula woke to it with a feeling of immense relief. She wondered why her heart was so light. Then she remembered it was Sunday. A gladness seemed to burst out around her, a feeling of great freedom. The whole world was for 24 hours revoked and put back into proper order. On Sunday, for one day, only the Sunday world existed. That's what we should feel like on this Sunday morning, right? It should be that feeling of, whoa, this is a great day. I don't have to do a whole bunch of stuff. I don't have a to-do list. I can just enjoy and let God put this place back to where it needs to be. How can we make that switch? How can you in your life? How do we change the idea of Sabbath as a little religious add-on, which I think we kind of see, to seeing it as something fundamental, how we see the world and how we look at the world? Some of us have been coming to a prayer study group that I'm doing, a couple of them, we're basing it on a book by Tish Harrison Warren called Prayer in the Night. And in the book, she talks about taking a vacation in New Hampshire and climbing Mount Washington with her partner. Now, Mount Washington, in my understanding, it's known for very erratic weather, probably like every mountain we know, right? I mean, mountains have a way of creating crazy weather around them. In a matter of minutes, the weather can change from being sunny and warm to like a blizzard. And the wind on the mountain is often strong enough to actually blow you off of the mountain, and it has done that. And the mountain is often surrounded by fog. But on the mountainside, along the trails, are cairns, C-A-I-R-N-S, that are built by fellow hikers. They're these massive, towering rock structures that not only plot the course, but in some of them, there's actually a cave where you can hide, a shelter. In a time of darkness, these cairns show the hiker on the journey, the way through. In times of deep darkness, the cairns that have kept me in the way of Jesus, she writes, were the prayers and practices of the church. We could not pray, the church said, here are our prayers. But when we do not believe, the church says, come here and be fed. When I could not worship, the church sang songs of faith over me. Then she goes on, and Heschel says the same thing, Rabbi Heschel, that what we're trying to do with Sabbath was we're trying to create one of those cairns with time. We're trying to set that Sabbath moment, time, whatever it is, there so you'll find your way again. It's a marking point for us. But if we don't do that, we're just going to get lost. And I think that's what happens to us. And so I'm hoping that this church can not only be a cathedral of space, right? Holy space, but it can be a way we can create Sabbath, a cathedral of time, a dome of time that can be a safe place for us. One of my favorite books is a book called Lost Boys of Sudan, but it's not called that. It's called What is the What? And it's about the Lost Boys of Sudan. Fantastic book, just a beautiful book. I mean, it reminds me of Encore a little bit because in the book, the boy, David Agers writes the book, but he's not one of the Lost Boys, but he writes about them. And the main character in the book, he has walked through Sudan, through war-torn, all sorts of stuff, all by himself. His parents are dead. His family's dead. He's there with about 6 feral boys trying to make it to a refugee camp. And they finally get there. And he's just wandering around the camp. You can kind of imagine him, right? Wandering around the camp, just wondering if he can find somebody he knows. There's got to be somebody from my village here. So he's walking, 10 years old, and finally doesn't find anybody. And he just gets overwhelmed. He's about ready to kind of give up on life. And then he looks into this tent, and there's this grandma figure, this old woman sitting there, and she's making a little food, and she's kind of sitting in her rocker too, kind of making patties, and she motions him, come on in. And so for some reason, he decides to go in, and he goes in, and she offers her lap and says, hey, come here, sit down on my lap. And he does. And he eats a couple of the patties that she's making, and he just sits on that lap. And just as he describes it, melts into her grace. He sits there for an hour. Then he gets up, goes on his way. Every day, about the same time, he comes back and sits on her lap. He has found Sabbath. And we learn to be that Sabbath for the world and each other, especially here. This isn't a time to count. It's not a time to cajole. It's a time to really welcome each other and say, hey, it's great to see you. Can't wait to see you again. No judgments at all. A place of grace, a cathedral of time and space. And all the people said, amen. Cassie's going to share a special number for us.